Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Clint coming to you from Grace Covenant. I'm getting you ready for worship this week. We're continuing our study with Adam Hamilton's book, John, the Gospel of Light and Life. And this week we're looking at the I am sayings. And we're sort of keeping a foot in chapter 2 as we move on to chapter 3 in worship, because we're going to be looking at the story of the raising of Lazarus. So it has elements of the miraculous sign story as well as the I am statements, and we see that those two things are frequently connected. This is a long story. It takes the story and its aftermath take up pretty much all of John chapter 11. The whole chapter is this story. And so there's a lot of ground to cover. So this is not going to be quite as in-depth as I usually get, just because there's so much there. And it's also one of the more confusing stories. John's Gospel, one of the things that's so interesting about it is we have this, what is referred to as a very high Christology in John, where Jesus is very godlike most of the time. And yet in this story we see Jesus as at one of his most human moments, but we also see Jesus acting not like what we would think Jesus would act like. You see this in John there, and occasionally in the other Gospels as well. Jesus doesn't always act very much like we would want to think Jesus acts. And this story has a couple of great examples of that. So I'm just going to outline the story rather than read the whole thing. It tells us that Lazarus was sick, and Mary and Martha, his sisters, send for Jesus. Mary and Martha are some of the characters, some of the people that appear in the other Gospels as well. But the stories that we have about Mary and Martha in the other Gospels don't appear in John, and this story, like so many of John's stories, don't appear anywhere else in the other Gospels. So it's easy for us to want to do a lot of crossover with that from a biographical standpoint, but from a story standpoint, we're meeting Mary and Martha. And so we can presume that Jesus already has some connection because of the way they interact with Jesus, but we don't know a lot about that. And so they send for Jesus, and when Jesus hears about it, he's not worried. In fact, he says, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Which is an interesting thing to say, and it's an interesting turn of phrase. This illness does not lead to death. Although we know, because it's the raising of Lazarus, that Lazarus does die in the story. That's an interesting aspect of this. And what it's doing is it's setting up the idea that Jesus knows what's going to happen, that this is sort of all part of the plan. So instead of going right to Lazarus to heal him, they kind of go, Jesus takes the disciples off and they go traveling some more. And then they finally, Mary and Martha get back in touch with them and let him know that Lazarus has indeed died. And Jesus responds to that. And it's clear that, once again, when Jesus is told that Lazarus is dead, his response is, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And so there's this sense of, Jesus knows what he's doing. And so while we're like wondering why Jesus would tarry, this is his friend, this is somebody he cares about, this is a family he cares about, why would he want them to go through this? His meaning in this is that so the disciples will have faith. And in the Gospel of John, the disciples aren't just the 12, and aren't just the community around Jesus, but it's also us. So this story is being told so that we will have faith. And so Jesus gets there, and he gets confronted by Martha first, and she's a little testy. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus asks her about the resurrection, and she says, I believe he'll be raised on the last day when everybody gets raised. And here's where we get the I am statement. It's in response to Martha that Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She says, yes, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. So we have an act of faith on Martha's part. And in these sign stories, there's frequently, and especially in John, there's this sense of there's an act of faith that has to go along with the miracle, a response needed by the recipient, shall we say, of the miracle. Whether it's the servants getting the water together to be turned into wine, or the blind man who has to go wash in the pool to get his sight back. And so this is Martha responding in faith to Jesus, that she was confident that Jesus could heal her brother, but now he's going a step further and saying, I can bring him back from the dead. And she believes. And so then Jesus goes and talks with Mary, and has a similar kind of exchange. This is one of the places in all the Gospels where we see Jesus at his most human. He doesn't weep because Lazarus is dead. He knows Lazarus is going to be okay. He weeps because he sees Mary weeping. So he's moved by compassion for this person he cares about. And so then Jesus goes to the tomb, and it's been several days by now, and that's an important part in the story. This is not, they thought and it's very clear that John wants to get this point across. This is not, he was really sick, Jesus was on his way, Jesus got there, he's dead, but then Jesus brings him back. John wants no confusion that this was a resurrection story, not a healing story. John has been in the tomb, he is wrapped in the clothes, he's all of that. He's been in there for a while, to the point where they don't want to take the stone away because they're afraid the body's going to smell. And Jesus calls to him and says, Lazarus, come out. And he does. It says, the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. So Lazarus in the tomb, Jesus does what he said he was going to do. What he told the disciples he would do, what he told Martha he was going to do, what he told Mary he was going to do. And this is a real, probably other than Jesus' own resurrection, this is the sign in John's gospel that sets everything apart. This was a unique sign. Were lots of stories about healers in the ancient world who had miraculous powers, but bringing people back from the dead, that was a whole new level. So And so since this is John, once again, the question isn't just the plot of the story, it's what is the deeper meaning that the story is trying to get across. And it goes back to that I am statement. I am the resurrection and the life. And so what part of what John's trying to get across is just like Jesus called Lazarus literally from the tomb out into life, he's calling us from death into life. And that death for us can take a lot of different forms. It's a literal death, but it can, there are lots of figurative deaths that we can experience in life. The death that is sin, the death that is grief, the death that is depression, all these sorts of death. And to all those forms of death, Jesus is calling us out of death, out of the tomb, back into life, into the life of the resurrection, the life of that he offers mainly through his own resurrection. So it's a fascinating story. It's interesting in John's story of Jesus. This is also the point at which Jesus' confrontation with the authorities goes from problem to mortal threat. This is when we first start hearing about them wanting to kill Jesus. And there's even a plot later on to try to kill Lazarus, because this story about Jesus and calling Lazarus back from the dead has gotten around, so the idea is that they're going to kill Lazarus too. So that's what we've got for this week. We're going to be talking more. We're going to be reading not the entire story, but a big chunk of the story in worship, and we're going to talk a lot more about what it means for Jesus to be the resurrection and the life for us. So I hope to see you on Sunday. Our small groups are going well. It's not too late to sign up for those. And I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you Sunday.